Hi friends, Father Kerry Walters here, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church. This is another Holy Spirit moment. This one, a life lesson from the ancients, Amenem-Opa on self-control. Amenem-Opa was an Egyptian sage who lived sometime in the 12th to the 11th century BC, thousands of years ago. He left a book of instructions for his son, but also for all generations that followed his son. And this book of instructions falls squarely within the Near Eastern tradition of wisdom literature. Wisdom literature is something that was extremely popular in the ancient Near East. You find it in the Mesopotamian culture, in the Babylonian culture, and of course in the Hebraic culture. We are most familiar with the wisdom literature of the Hebrews because a lot of it has been embedded in the Hebrew scriptures, or what Christians call the Old Testament. Wisdom literature offers practical advice to human beings on how to live well-ordered, enriched, good lives. It isn't necessarily religious in tone or metaphysical in tone. Instead, its feet are squarely on the ground, offering us advice on how to navigate our way through the ups and the downs that life can throw at us. Wisdom literature then typically presents itself in short snippets, proverbs, maxims, sayings that an individual can easily learn and take to heart. One of the primary bits of advice in wisdom literature is the necessity of self-control, or what you might call prudence. Self-control as a way in which the intellect or the reason overcomes impetuosity, the impetuousness of our desires, and our temptation to act thoughtlessly and rashly. Amenem-Opa's book of instructions clearly was very influential in the Near East. You will find traces of it in the Hebrew scriptures. As a matter of fact, if you look in the book of Proverbs in the Hebrew scriptures, from about mid-chapter 22 to mid-chapter 24 is almost a direct transcription of pieces of Amenem-Opa's book. Now, Amenem-Opa wants to make sure that his son lives a good and enriched life, and so he offers these instructions to him, and he begins his book by saying something that I think is really quite significant. Listen to Amenem-Opa's words. Give thy ears, hear what is said. Give thy heart to understand them. To put them in thy heart is worthwhile, but it's damaging to those who neglect them. Let them rest in the casket of thy belly, that they may be a key to thy heart. In the Egyptian world, the heart was identical to what you and I would call the mind or the intellect or perhaps reason. So what Amenem-Opa is doing is offering sage advice to instruct the intellect of his son. He basically is saying, my son, if you would live a well-ordered life, you're going to have to think about what your priorities are, what your desires are, whether the desires that you have are ill-fitted or well-fitted to a good life, and how to achieve them. So in chapter 4, he gives one of the pieces of advice that he considers to be most important. And he puts it in metaphor in a really quite delightful but memorable way. This is what he says. The hothead is like a tree growing in the forest. In a moment he loses his branches and finds his end in the shipyards. He's floated far away from his place, and the fire is his grave. But the truly prudent man holds himself apart. He's like a tree growing in a garden. He flourishes and multiplies his fruit. He abides in the presence of his God. His fruit is sweet, his shade is pleasant, and he finds his end in the garden. Now, of course, what Amenem-Opa is saying is that a person who is hot-headed, rash, impetuous, who drives with his emotions and his passions rather than his reason and his intellect, is like a tree growing in the wild. A tree growing in the wild that very soon will lose its standing, will either fall because of internal rot or will be cut down because of impetuosity on the part of others and will quickly be burnt, will not last long. But the truly prudent person, the person of self-control, the kind of person that Amenem-Opa hopes his son will grow up to be, is an individual who cultivates himself carefully in a garden, who recognizes that he wants his achievements in life, his fruit, to be plentiful and sweet, and who wants to stand before God with a clear conscience. That can be achieved. This kind of self-control, this self-discipline can be achieved once again through hearkening to the heart, or as we would say, the intellect, the mind, one's sense of what's right and what's wrong, one's prudence. So for the next chapters, chapter by chapter, what Amenem-Opa is going to do is to offer different kinds of counsel that will enable his son and us today to exercise self-control, self-discipline. So, for example, he gives advice on how to cultivate patience, how to achieve compassion, how to be honest in one's dealings with others, how to speak truthfully and calmly instead of deceptively and rashly. He goes through any number of what you and I today would call virtues that can be that are necessary for the exercise of a good life, and that can all be achieved through self-control. But towards the end of his book of instructions, he says something that I think is also extremely important. It's in chapter 25, the 25th chapter out of the book's 30 chapters, and he says this: "Laugh not at a blind man, nor mock at a dwarf. Injure not a cripple, and mock not a man who is in the hand of God." He means someone who's suffering from mental illness. "Neither be harsh towards him when he transgresses. As for men, they are clay and straw, and God is their builder. God pulls down and builds up again daily. God makes 1,000 humble as he will, and 1,000 he makes overseers." This is an important bit of advice because I think that what Amenem-Opa is telling his son is, in addition to cultivating all of these virtues, what you need to do is to make sure that you recognize your place in the grand scheme of things. You need to be humble. You need to recognize that all human beings, regardless of their station in life, regardless of their personal qualities, their talents, or their lack thereof, are made equally by the hand of God, of the same material, and that some people are chosen by God to be overseers, and some people are chosen by God not to be overseers. And that your position of privilege, my son, is something that was given to you by God, and it is not something that you innately earned. So humility is called for if one desires to be a good person. Humility is called for if one truly seeks to lead a rich life. Humility is called for because what we are is not completely in our hands. To a certain extent, our destiny has been determined by our gods, or what perhaps you and I might today say, by our genes, by our class, by the country in which we were born, by our economic status. Those are the gratuitous facts of our existence, and we should always heed where we come from before we start judging other people. Amenem-Hotep's advice is so pertinent today, it seems to me, in the culture in which we live. You can easily find versions of it online, or you can find a selection from Amenem-Hotep's instructions in a book that collects ancient Near Eastern documents. My friends, this has been another Holy Spirit moment, focusing on another life lesson from the ancients. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.